Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host. Greatly appreciate you giving us a little bit of your time today and joining us for today's episode. The episode today is going to be going back to 1981 and a fork in time there that centers around, in this case, an assassination attempt. One of the things I know that we will discover as we continue to move forward with the podcast and the nature of alternate history is that some of the most critical, sort of easy to identify forks in time are around those of assassinations that are successful, and probably equally so around assassinations that are unsuccessful. Because this marks a singular, easy, in some ways, moment in time to identify where things could have gone down two different paths, and particularly when you have a strong, influencing individual in history, the presence or the absence of that individual, either way, can certainly have a tremendous impact on what happens in the near-term timeline, and then obviously the potential ripples that can move forward from that as we look at an alternate history. So today on the podcast, we're going to look at what might have happened if the attempted assassination of recently inaugurated American President Ronald Reagan had succeeded in March, late March of 1981, and what might the impact or the changes have been in a situation where barely slightly more than 2 months into his presidency, Reagan's first term, his term would have ended, and we would have had a change in leadership in the United States during a very critical time, the early 1980s, as the nation was still attempting to recover from a deep economic recession and was facing the challenges that we would see in the real timeline that lay ahead in the 1980s in the Cold War. So today on A Fork in Time, we're going to look at the potential fork of what would have happened if Ronald Reagan had actually been assassinated on March 30th of 1981. I will include a few links in the show notes for those that may not know about the actual events themselves, so that we don't spend a lot of time on the podcast here talking about the assassination attempt. But it was outside of a hotel in Washington, D.C. By John Hinckley Jr., and Reagan was rushed to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery, and we'll talk a little bit perhaps as we move through the podcast here about some of the events of that day and how they play out on what the potential succession would have been. Not in the obvious succession, which was that Vice President George H.W. Bush would have become president earlier, 7 years earlier, or rather 8 years earlier than he actually did. But we'll focus more on the actual events, not of that day, but what would have come after that day. So the first thing to note about that day is that, again, it is very early in the Reagan presidency. So it's one of the things I think that's going to be difficult to do as we move through this alternate timeline, this fork in time, is forgetting the things that we know about what happened in the real Reagan presidency, the 2 terms that he served, realizing that all of that has not come to be yet as we find ourselves in late March of 1981. And so one of the most difficult challenges in looking at this fork in time is trying to decipher how much of what happened after that is the result of Reagan still being the president versus what would have happened if others had assumed the office. So I'm actually going to just flat out say that many listeners to the podcast today probably come from very polarized views on Ronald Reagan as a president. Among Americans, particularly conservative Americans, conservative American Republicans, he's a revered figure. It's been argued that if we were putting up Mount Rushmore today and you were looking for which presidents may go on that mountain, as opposed to the 4 that are there now, you would probably find Reagan being put forward as one of the ones for consideration. And so he is very beloved by a number of members, even today, as we're in 2019, of the Republican Party and among conservatives in the United States. There are equally those who were opposed to him then that remain probably as vehement in their beliefs about him now. And so one of the things to realize is that Reagan politically often during his presidency and after his presidency was a polarizing figure. And so assertions that I may make today may be immediately challenged by some listeners just because they hold a different view of Reagan than I may be asserting at that time. I'm going to try to be balanced today as I move through this exploration of an alternate history timeline, but I do understand and am sensitive to the fact that for many listeners, some of the things that I may say may border on the verge of what they may think of as being political heresy when we think about a situation that would have occurred without Reagan in the presidency. So I just say that up front, knowing that that's something that I'm aware of and that our listeners, I hope, will also be aware of, and that they'll have an open mind just to consider some of the things that I'm going to propose. Because as we've often mentioned before in the past on A Fork in Time, I think one of the interesting things to consider sometimes about forks in history is that while they may appear to make fairly substantial changes in timelines, they may not always have as much of an impact as we think they do. And that's actually one of the options that we'll explore today. So among the things to consider in an alternate timeline where Reagan is assassinated and suddenly George H.W. Bush, Vice President Bush, assumes the presidency. He would do that eventually, but it would be only after the end of 2 terms of a Reagan presidency. So one of the things to think about is what the situation was in 1981 and who George Bush, now the president in 1981, was versus who George just the president in 1989 might be. And one of the things to focus on there is actually the 1980 presidential election, which was a very contentious election, actually drew a third-party candidate into the election, and Reagan defeated one-term incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter very substantially, both in terms of popular vote as well as in terms of the Electoral College vote. It was a mandate, so to speak, for the Republicans sweeping into power for the presidency with Reagan at the helm of that. However, Bush had been a challenger to Reagan. In fact, he was the last surviving challenger to Reagan during the primaries and only withdrew, actually suspended his campaign about a month and a half before the Republican convention, and then actually what at the convention was chosen to be Ronald Reagan's running mate. The two of them did not agree on a number of issues, particularly economic issues. In fact, probably the most famous quote from the 1980 campaign when Bush, opposing Reagan in the Republican primary, referred to Reagan's policies regarding, or proposed policies regarding taxation and tax cuts and supply side economics as quote unquote voodoo economics. And so to say that they were not in lockstep on issues, certainly issues such as economic issues, would be a very fair thing to say. Bush had a background as being the former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I think for many folks was considered to be more of a moderate Republican. Reagan certainly came from the conservative ranks of the Republican Party, which caused him to be in more contrast to the incumbent president, the Democrat Jimmy Carter, but also made him something that was easily distinguished from more of a career Republican, sometimes even referred to as a bureaucrat, which is somehow as Bush was thought of, having held a number of high offices, including appointed positions inside of the Republican Party, but also inside of government. Again, I mentioned his role as CIA director in the 1970s. But Bush was certainly considered to be more moderate on economic policy and might be argued as being slightly more moderate on his position towards the Soviet Union. That is not to say that any of the candidates during that period of time would not have been considered someone who was staunch in support of Western Europe and the NATO alliance as opposed to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But certainly Reagan took a much stronger stance, much more of an anti-communist stance, even in his primary campaign, and certainly that carried over into his actual presidency and was part of what was there in the early parts of his presidency that would have existed up to the moment of the assassination. For most observers who look back on history, again, depending upon your view of Reagan, you either see him as the individual who is greatly responsible, tremendously responsible for the winning of the Cold War, taking the Soviet Union on, challenging the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s, particularly on issues like strategic weapons, arms control, and taking a very hard-line position in negotiations with the Soviet Union, and believing that it was only through a buildup of the United States military and a position of strength that the Soviet Union could be confronted and the United States would ultimately win the Cold War. That view of history is certainly held by a large number of historians and by a large number of Americans, and maybe those around the globe as well, but certainly I can speak for those in America who view Reagan as the hardliner, anti-communist protagonist who, more than anyone else, led us through the 1980s and led to the eventual result being the collapse of the Soviet Union late in the 1980s, even though that was after his presidency had come to an end. The other take that you will see from historians is that eventually the Soviet Union's collapse was going to be inevitable. It was going to happen as a result of the economic climate, not being able to sustain their economy, not being able to continue to sustain building of arms and trying to develop a modern economic system. And so that the Soviet Union essentially collapsed under its own weight, that it collapsed as a result of its involvement in the 70s in various crises around the world, particularly in the Middle East, the 1979 Afghanistan invasion, and the war that they become engaged with in Afghanistan, fighting against freedom fighters there after they've invaded the country, that eventually the Soviet Union came to end as a result of more internal pressures, while also obviously being pressured from the West externally. And so, sort of the two views on the Soviet collapse is that Reagan and other allies, for example, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, German Chancellor Kohl, are major protagonists in making the situation come to be that will cause the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the demise of the Soviet Union. The other extreme would be that, yes, Reagan played a role in that, but it really wasn't so much Reagan. Any Western United States president maintaining something that more or less had been the position for a period of time would have gained the benefits because the collapse was mostly the result of an internal Soviet collapse. So, in considering the alternate timeline, your view on Reagan's role in the foreign policy situation of the 1980s, particularly the United States as leading the efforts to against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, that makes a big difference in terms of how you think this plays out. If Reagan is that important, as some would argue, as a figure, as someone who had the credentials to stand up to the Soviet communism, to stand up to the Soviet leadership, to take a hardline position, particularly through building up the United States military and making it clear that there was the potential that the United States would be willing to engage in military action if the Soviets continued some of the things that they were doing. If you take the stance that Reagan was that important as an individual, then losing him in March of 1981 becomes very important because you don't have someone most likely in what would then be President Bush, George H.W. Bush, who is as much of a hardliner, if you will, on those issues, and probably would not have been as inclined to approach the situation the same way that Reagan did. Bush gains a lot of credit, particularly during his presidency and later, for his skill as a diplomat. I think that is something that most historians would agree that is something that you can attribute to George Bush as a president and as an individual. One of his skill sets was his ability to use diplomacy and to use diplomatic means to accomplish the goals of what was there. Not to say that Reagan was not a diplomat, but Reagan was much more of a communicator about a position and was less inclined to enter into negotiations for the sake of negotiating than Bush would have been. So again, if you take the stance that Reagan as a hardliner, as someone who was vehement in how he opposed the Soviet Union, was the critical factor or a critical factor in the demise of the Soviet Union throughout the course of the 1980s and ultimately the end of the Cold War that we see come to fruition in the late 80s and moving into the 1990s, then losing Ronald Reagan in 1981 has a much more impactful situation than probably might be imagined. If you hold to the other position, the one I outlined there, that it really is, yes, Reagan was important, but it really was more the result of forces, internal forces of the Soviet Union, the natural flow of history. In other words, Reagan as a persona is not as important in the end of the Cold War, just that the geopolitics and the economics of the situation would have eventually led to this collapse. Then Reagan's departure from the scene in 1981 becomes far less critical. In fact, you might easily argue that someone with President Bush's background and skill set and previous positions and other things might have been able to move through some negotiated resolution of some of those things even faster than Reagan would have. The question that you have to ask, and thinking through what the alternative timeline would have looked like, is would the negotiations that actually have occurred in 1980, particularly the strategic arms limitation talks, some of the intermediate range missile issues that arose, whether that would have played out substantially different under a Bush administration than it did under a Reagan administration. My take or my argument actually is somewhere in between. I do believe that if you look back on history, you will find that a great deal of what caused the Soviet Union to collapse was the result of things that were already in motion actually before Reagan is elected in 1980 and takes office in 1981. I think it's also fair to argue that Reagan's position and his vehemence on a United States military buildup being more confrontational in relations with the Soviet Union, less of what had be known as the parlance of the 1970s, less détente with the Soviet Union, probably did help accelerate a process that was already in motion. So my take on Reagan's importance, and thus the importance of Reagan if he's removed from the equation, is that while he's not a causal factor, he probably is not even the primary causal factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is very much an accelerant to the process and someone that makes sure the process is going to actually happen, probably more so than an administration under George Bush would have been. So losing Reagan to an assassin's bullet in March of 1981 would have altered the course of history, probably in terms of the speed of the collapse of the Soviet Union and perhaps in the exact way that the collapse went down. There may have been a scenario under a Bush administration where there may have been lifelines, if you will, thrown to the Soviet Union in exchange for some arms reduction and some of the other things that were there that would have enabled the Soviet Union to have lasted longer. Ultimately, probably still collapsing under the weight of the forces that led to its collapse, but perhaps extending the timeline. So I think the biggest difference in the assassination scenario here between a Reagan presidency and a Bush presidency is the speed at which the end of the Cold War might have happened. It ultimately does happen actually ironically, under Bush's only administration, the George H.W. Bush's term that begins in 1989. That's actually when the Cold War begins to collapse. In another episode, we talked about the fall of the Berlin Wall. That actually happens during Bush's watch, but only after the end of 2 Reagan terms. And so again, that's one of the things that likely would have been different, would be the scenario under which there is a slowdown perhaps in the end of the Cold War and the results that came from that. Probably the other major difference that one would have to look at would be not in a foreign affairs situation, but would have to be domestically. And certainly there were differences in thought between Reagan and Bush on economics. Again, I mentioned the famous 1980 quote where Bush called Reagan's supply side economics voodoo economics. And so remembering that in early 1981, in March of 1981, the tax cuts that came as a result of that election that were being pushed through the House of Representatives and through the Senate that would be enacted in 1981 hadn't fully come to be yet. And so one of the questions that would have to be asked is, if suddenly there is a President Bush in 1981, how would he have sustained or chosen to carry forth the economic legacy that Reagan had set there? And that's actually, to me, a more interesting challenge and a more interesting question. One of the things that certainly happens, we saw this during the 1960s in the United States when President Johnson assumes the presidency following the assassination of President Kennedy, is that it's the difficult situation that the newly non-elected directly president, the vice president who's assumed the presidency, has to take in terms of looking at the legacy of the person that he's replaced versus what they might do independently as an individual. And so one of the questions to be asked is, given the status of the economic situation in the United States, would President Bush in 1981 be as willing to go along and push for the tax cuts and the other economic reforms, but primarily tax cuts that were part of the 1981 Tax Act that was passed by the United States Congress? My take on that is that Bush probably would have felt obligated to move forward with some of that legacy, but then the question remains how committed he would have been to that over the next few years. Because while revisionist history tends to look back and see that there was an immediate change in the economy, that's really not the case. The economic recovery didn't begin for a good 18 to 24 months after March of 1981 and was still somewhat tenuous even as we move into the 1983 and then ultimately the 1984 campaign. And so my take on a potential 1981 Bush presidency is that there probably would have been difficulty in Bush distancing himself from the economic policies that had been laid out and had allowed for the election of President Reagan, but he may have been more apt to quickly step back from them or to alter them as time moved forward. And so again, it's one of those questions of how much is the Reagan personality a player in what happens on the economic front. Reagan is very convinced, is very much a believer in the economic concept that he's brought with him, the idea of supply side economics and tax cuts to stimulate the economy. He is much more inclined to stay the course, even despite some of the challenges that come during the 1982 midterm elections and some of the other things that are there. Whereas a Bush presidency, I think it is very arguable, he would have been more likely to take a step back. And so you may have seen a different path to economic recovery during 1980 under a presidency where George Bush has assumed following a Reagan assassination than you did otherwise. Again, it's also one of those things to realize how much control is there. Again, very similar to the foreign policy argument, we know that the capitalistic American economy tends to be in a cyclical in nature. And very often while presidents and leaders take the blame and or get the responsibility for good results or bad results, it's not solely something necessarily that they've caused or caused to be. It would have been inevitable to some degree that there would have been an economic recovery sometime in the 1980s following the recession of the 1970s. So the question to be asked and what might be different about an alternate timeline is Reagan's push for tax cuts and his commitment to supply side economics, was that a stimulus that caused that to move faster, or was it something that would have eventually happened on its own? My take again is actually going to be something down the middle here. I don't think, candidly, I don't believe personally that any president deserves full responsibility for either all of the good things or bad things that happen economically. Very often the stage is set long before they assume office for either the good or the bad things that are going to happen. It's the nature of a cyclical capitalistic economy that that's going to be the case. And some of it's just the luck of the timing for presidents when they assume the presidency and if they catch the blame for things that are going bad during their tenure or during their term. So again, I hold more to that middle ground that presidents get more credit. They also probably get more blame. And I think that's also true here. I think that we would have seen the economic recovery. I think that there would have been, in a potential Bush reelection campaign in 1984, the ability to point back to the fact that the economy was stronger and things were moving in a positive direction. What would have been different, though, is the question of whether or not that would have been given a status or a legacy, if you will, to Reagan, even though he wasn't there to preside over it. It would be the halo effect that often happens around a fallen leader, particularly an assassinated president, where their legacy, what's assigned to them is all the good things that happen that they set in motion, but yet they are not held responsible for any of the bad things that happen because they're not there to be held responsible for it. And so even with economic growth, assuming that Bush would have carried forth with the economic policies that had already been put in motion by Reagan before this potential assassination. It's interesting to know whether or not he would have been able to really take full claim for that in the same way that Reagan did in 1984. Sort of the Morning in America concept is something that is uniquely Reagan, probably not something that is going to be passed over or equally placed on and be able to take advantage of by a Bush presidency. I should just note, because I'm not going to spend the time here on the episode today, but could and perhaps we will do on a future episode, there's a number of other things that you can see just in the area of foreign policy that might also have been different. For example, there's the eventual involvement of the United States in the Iran-Contra affair. There's the situation regarding how the hostage situations around the world were handled with Americans. These are not the easy sort of big picture to identify how the United States stood in because of Reagan and the Cold War, but a number of other areas. So communist expansion into Latin America and situations like the Contras, the invasion of Grenada, United States support for Afghanistan. Again, the handling of situations like Lebanon and other hot points that were part of the contention between the United States and the Soviet Union, the big picture for the Cold War, but were played out far differently in local theaters of action. And it's certainly arguable if we go down each of those paths of an alternative history, when you look at Reagan's personality versus a Bush personality, you would see a difference in terms of how those things would be played out, particularly as those things related to foreign affairs. Um, on the domestic side, again, the questions I've already called for there are also very different, because if you have a different, slower economic recovery and perhaps a more challenging 1984 presidential election for a now Republican incumbent George Bush, how that would have played out economically over the balance of the 1980s would also be very different. So again, this particular topic may be worthy of an additional sort of revisit discussion at some point, just to look at all the things that are there, because it's not just a simple change, because it's a very impactful 8 years that are represented by the Reagan presidency and then what flows from that. But those are just a few of the other examples of things that we could cover in more detail today, but we'll save that for a future episode. Finally, the last thing I would like to look at actually does play out not just so much in what the policies would be under what actually happened with the Reagan administration, what would have happened with an earlier Bush administration, but recognizing that the timing of a Reagan assassination in March of 1981 would have made for an interesting scenario moving forward, in the sense that because more than half of that term remained, George Bush, now the president, assuming that role in 1981, would have been able to run for re-election in 1984, but would not have been able to run for re-election in 1988, just as Reagan could not run for re-election. And so someone with the experience, qualifications, the other things that would have been there that existed in George Bush having been vice president for 8 years would not have existed in George Bush in 1988. So there are two particular things that I think are worth considering that relate around this, because once you elevate Bush from the vice presidency to the presidency, one of the first questions you have to ask in 1981 is, who is a likely candidate to have become the vice president? And that's an important question to ask, but for two reasons. It probably does have an impact on Bush's reelection chances in 1984, also potentially on how policy is played out depending on the role or influence of that new vice president who's assumed the position in 1981. But it also sets up the scenario for who is the likely heir apparent to be able to run for the Republican ticket, assuming that George Bush wins re-election in 1984, and in 1988 now the vice president that has taken his place will be most likely the presumptive nominee for the candidacy in 1988. I'm going to put forth two possible options here. There are a number of possible options, and I very quickly realized that, but two that are intriguing to me that come to mind, and to think about what the potential changes might have been under each of those. One possibility is someone in 1981 like a Robert Dole assuming the role of the vice presidency. So Senator Dole, who would later and who had run and would later run for the office, eventually would become a Republican nominee subsequently in the future. If he assumes that role, he would be more of a somewhat moderate, somewhat centrist Republican. And so you might have seen a scenario where the Republican Party under Reagan, which had grown very conservative at that point and would grow subsequently more conservative, might have moderated, not only as the result of George Bush becoming president at an earlier time, perhaps taking slightly more of a moderate tact, even though still being perhaps upholding some of the Reagan legacy and some of the conservative ideals that were there, certainly through the first term. You might have seen more of a shift back towards a more moderate or centrist position in the 1984 election. That could have been aided by the person that may have been chosen to be vice president. The example that I'm giving here would be if you have someone like a Robert Dole who assumes that role. Another possible candidate that's sort of probably in that same ilk, someone who is very close to President Bush, both in his life story, historically in his biography, but also during the presidency, was then Chief of Staff James Baker. Baker would later become Treasury Secretary under Reagan, and Baker would later become Secretary of State under the Bush administration that commences in 1989. Baker, a lifelong friend, a political confidant, and ally of George Bush, as the chief of staff, might have easily found himself being elevated to the position of vice president, and again, filling more of that centrist, moderate type of role. Certainly a very competent man. Almost all historians would judge him that way, sort of regardless of what party you adhere to. And so you would have seen the scenario under which there may have been a moderation of the Bush presidency as a result of who the new vice president would be. Perhaps in the other direction, though, would be someone like maybe a Jack Kemp. Kemp would eventually run for president in 1988. Kemp was one of the advocates for, as a member of in leadership in the House in 1981, for the tax cut that has passed through, and had very strong conservative credentials, particularly conservative economic credentials. And so it's easy to imagine a scenario where Bush, looking to curry favor with the conservative wing of the Republican Party, to sort of give a nod towards Reagan's conservatism and the power of the conservative wing of the party, may have suggested or nominated someone like Jack Kemp to be the vice president. So in that scenario, you have more of a conservative influence in the role of the vice presidency, and you would have had maybe less of attack or move to the center directly, just as a result of who comprises the administration or who is the vice president. You can easily see that scenario being the case where Kemp is chosen to be vice president, already looking ahead towards the 1984 reelection, the realization that Bush is now going to have to stand inside of his own party, and he will be viewed as being more of a uniter of the party and open to a broader spectrum of the party's conservative and more moderate wings as a result of appointing Kemp into the vice presidency and allowing Kemp to be vice president. That sets up a very different scenario, though, for 1988. Kemp, very young by political standards at that point, he did run in 1988, now potentially runs in lieu of what actually happened in the real timeline, where George H.W. Bush runs to succeed what was the Reagan presidency. Now Kemp is looking to succeed the Bush presidency. And with one of two possible bends to that. One is to sort of continue the path, a more conservative path that he's been able to carve that presidency into in his role as vice president, or perhaps if there's been more moderation under a Bush presidency, to move the party a little bit more to the right. So it's a delayed growth of the power of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. It loses its champion in the case of Reagan because of the assassination. It gains an internal champion inside of the administration in terms of new Vice President Kemp, and then eventually it takes over the leadership of the party potentially in the 1988 election as a result of Kemp gaining the nomination and perhaps winning the election, and thus having 1989 be the first year of a Kemp administration following a Bush administration versus a Bush administration following a Reagan administration if the assassination had actually been successful back in 1981. So if you look at that scenario, that does change electoral politics moving forward. One might argue that Kemp being younger, not being as beholden to some of the Republican norms, may have in a 1989 win, a 1988 win, assuming the presidency in 1989, may have been able to chart a slightly different course. And so by the time you reach the 1992 election, now there's all kinds of variables that have entered into play. What has happened on the foreign policy front? What has happened on the domestic front during a Bush presidency versus the timeline that we know the Reagan presidency? But it might have been possible to sustain an 8-year extension of Republican control of the White House beginning in 1989 versus the 4-year extension that happened under Bush. In many ways, my take on the Bush administration is it wasn't a question of his competency as president. If you look at many of the accomplishments that were there, again, actually bringing an end to the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, dealing with the aggression of Iraq into Kuwait, there were many things that were favorable for George Bush, but the economic price that had to be paid as a result of the tax cuts and the budget deficits that had mounted during the 1980s resulted in the tax deal that eventually many will point to as being what led to Bush's demise in 1992, when he reneged on his promise in the 1988 election of read my lips, no new taxes. That was a result of having to inherit the Reagan economic and taxation legacy, not the one that he may have charted on his own. And so by the time we reach a 1988 with now Vice President Kemp as the Republican nominee, we might have had a different economic setup at that time, enabling Kemp to potentially extend a recovery that started later. Potentially, we talked about that earlier, as a result of Bush's role in the economics versus Reagan's in the early part of the 1980s, a recovery that started later but may have sustained longer. So that by the time 1992 rolls around, there's less economic pressure being brought to bear that the Democrats are able to bring during that election, which is part of the or one of the factors that leads to the end of Republican domination of the White House after 12 years. And so one of the interesting consequences of the failed assassination attempt, or if it had been successful assassination attempt in 1981, really is thinking about what would have happened in the 1988 election and potentially subsequently in the 1992 election. Certainly, if you look back over American political history, there tends to be the going back and forth between the two parties. No party tends to remain in power for too long, just because of also the cyclical nature of American politics, where there's normally not a desire to allow either party to remain, particularly holding the White House for an extended period of time. And so it's probably equally effective to argue that by the time 1992 would have rolled around, regardless of the real timeline where it's Bush seeking his second term or whether it is Kemp seeking his second term, assuming that he's the winner in 1988, you still may have seen the pendulum swing back to favor a Democratic presidency, uh, Clinton or someone else who might have run in 1992. That's a whole other potential what if to consider, is whether or not these circumstances would have led to the rise of a Bill Clinton or not. But you could have seen that as well. One of the other things to think about, though, is would the situation have been different in 1988? Depending upon a slow economic recovery, there's not as much of the euphoria around the success of what's going on in terms of sustaining the containment of the Soviet Union. You can already see some of the signs of what will lead towards the end of the Cold War, even happen in the latter part of the Reagan presidency. It's possible that if some of those things are delayed, there may have been a more viable 1988 Democratic challenge. Michael Dukakis ran a fairly successful campaign that year against an incumbent party in control, but you might have seen a scenario where the Democrats would have been able to put or exert more pressure during the 1988 election, or you might have seen the scenario of what happened in 1992 where a third party enters the race happen earlier as well. So again, one of the other potential fallouts of an alternative timeline here of the fork is not just what happens during the period from 1981 to 1984 or from 1981 through 1988, but how that sets up for 1988 and thereafter. And I think one of the things that would have been a major component or a factor in determining that would have been who would have been chosen as the successor to George Bush in 1981. I guess the other thing to consider here, because there's a lot of potential what ifs along that line, is let's again assume the scenario where it's Jack Kemp who comes in. I can definitely see that scenario because of wanting to give a nod to the conservative part of the party. But by the time we reach 1984, maybe he's become disillusioned inside of a Bush White House. And so there's a need to switch over to another candidate to be brought in. And the potential exists there for someone to rise up more on the conservative portion of the Republican Party and challenge Bush in the 1984 primaries. I think that is unlikely, particularly given that there would have been the death of a Republican president just slightly more than 3 years before. Bush would have been viewed in whatever context as being trying to pick up the legacy of that, and people would have been looking to give him his terms in his own right. You sometimes hear that term used, but it's also possible that because of his differences between his points of view and his ideology and the strong conservative elements that were represented by Reagan, would have been represented by Kemp, and would have been represented by others, may have caused tension within the Republican Party in 1984. And depending on what would have happened with the economic situation or perhaps other events globally, you could easily imagine a scenario where even the 1984 election is not the landslide re-election that was seen by Reagan, but something that was much more contested and wouldn't have had the coattails further down the ballot that was particularly seen in 1984 that also swept in other changes in terms of governorships and state legislatures across the United States. Finally, to bring things into the current political context in the United States, It's hard not to notice that many times now, particularly in the in the last 4 to 6 years, much of what goes on inside the Republican Party in the United States is to vie for the Reagan legacy. That's viewed as being how you appeal to the conservatives that are within the party, and to some degree, President Trump's election as a result of claiming that he is the heir apparent to that legacy. Others would make that claim as well. In fact, it was sort of the recurring theme of the 2016 Republican primaries was who could claim to who could be more Reagan than someone else. And Bush certainly, Trump certainly played that card regularly during his election, but others who were in the field did as well. So imagine 1981, there is a Reagan legacy that results as a result of his assassination, but is the legacy the same? Because again, prior to that, we have him as governor of California. We have his career before politics, acting, and the other things that he did that sort of brought him to fame and eventually led to him being elected president. But we don't have any of the things, particularly the Cold War, the foreign affairs success that folks would look to for the 1980s to be attached as the Reagan legacy. Would that legacy be the Bush legacy? Would it be the Bush-Kemp legacy? Would it somehow be the Kemp legacy? Again, I'm talking here exclusively about the conservative elements of the Republican Party. We would not have the same Reagan influence on politics today that we do if you don't have Reagan in the role of president after March of 1981. How much different that would be, I think, is a very difficult thing to discern for all the reasons we've talked about. It's difficult to know how much credit he would have been given for what happened after his death versus how much would have been attributed to other folks. The closest analogy that I have to it would be the things that are attributed to the success of President Kennedy, in many cases that were carried forward and were brought into action as a result of President Johnson. But it's not quite the same because there was more than a 2-month Kennedy presidency. Kennedy is assassinated in late 1963. It's over 2.5 years into his term. And so there is a track record to be pointed back to, both positive and negative, for President Kennedy before things transitioned to the Johnson administration. That same track record doesn't exist for Reagan as president. There literally is slightly more than 2 months, not 2 years, but slightly more than 2 months have passed before the assassination is successful under this potential alternate timeline. And so his legacy may still exist. He may still be viewed as being, if you will, a martyr somehow for conservative causes, although the shooting was not politically motivated at all, as we know. But it would have been different than it is today. And so the shadow that Ronald Reagan has cast over American politics since the 1980s would be different. I'm not arguing that it would be better or that it would be worse, but I'm definitely arguing that it would be different. And I think it's far less likely that the current political climate or the political climate of the last 6 to 10 years would have been those clamoring for being the new incarnation of Reagan. They may have referenced Reagan. They may have talked about the things that weren't able to be accomplished because of Reagan's term being cut short. But the legacy of Reagan and his impact on current electoral politics and even governance in the United States would be very different. So there's no doubt that one of the changes that we would still be feeling today, regardless of how you think things would have worked out over the 1980s, for the things that we've talked about, both for foreign and domestic policy, we would definitely be living in a different world today when Ronald Reagan was invoked, if he was invoked by candidates or by politicians, it would be different than it is today. So one of the things that definitely did not change on March 30 of 1981 with Reagan's survival was that we have a legacy. One of the things that definitely would have changed was the Reagan legacy would have been different. So lots more that we could say about this. And again, I think we probably will revisit it again on a subsequent episode, looking at some more things in detail. This is one of those events in history that's probably not just worthy of a single consideration about what the fork in time would be. And so I think we will find ourselves back to the exploration of a different outcome after March 31, 1981 at some point in the future. So as we conclude the episode for today, once again, we want to say thank you to those of you that have joined us today here on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. We always encourage you to visit our website. That is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Again, as we always say, the A is important and the podcast is important. To find us there at the website, you'll find ways to access our entire library and archive of shows. You'll find ways to provide us feedback, including our listener survey, as well as topic suggestions and feedback that you can provide us on individual episodes. I suspect that many of the listeners of this episode may have some different thoughts on this. I would welcome, very, very much welcome, that you go and leave us that feedback for us to understand what you think I got right and what you think I got wrong, because that can even feed into the subsequent episode when we come back and revisit this. Of course, there on the website, you can also find various links to how we appear on social media. You can also find a link to our Patreon page where you can go and pledge if you want to, if you're able to, financial support to help offset some of the costs of the podcast and to continue to allow us to deliver it to you. So as always, we appreciate the fact that you've given us the best gift of all, which is the gift of your time and your attention. And we hope that at least something that has been exposed to you today is something that will cause you to think about what's happened in the last quarter century plus and how things could have been different. And we welcome you to join us again on our next episode of A Fork in Time. So bye for now.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.